The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but Marcus Elijah Hayes could already feel the heat building in the white coral rock beneath his knees. September 20th, 1944. 6:42 in the morning. Peleliu Island Pacific Theatre. His hands shook as he turned the pages of his notebook, the waterproof cover stained with salt, and something darker that might have been blood. 106 tally marks, 106 calculations, 106 men who would never go home. Sergeant Cole Thaddeus Brennan knelt beside him in the trench, close enough that Marcus could smell the tobacco on his breath and the copper scent of the bandage wrapped around his head. The bandage had been white 3 days ago. Now it was the color of rust. "Can you still shoot?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the unearthly scope lying across his lap, 24 inches of precision glass and blackened steel. The crack ran diagonally across the objective lens like a frozen lightning bolt. It had appeared yesterday afternoon at exactly 2:17 p.m. when a Japanese bullet had punched through 3 sandbags and grazed the scope tube with enough force to make his teeth rattle. The glass had held. Barely. "One more," Marcus said quietly. "Just one more." Brennan's jaw worked, chewing tobacco he'd run out of 2 days ago, the habit so ingrained he couldn't stop. The big Irishman looked out across the valley toward the northern ridge, where the morning shadows still clung to the coral like oil on water. Somewhere out there, in a hide that 5 days of hunting hadn't revealed, was the Japanese sniper they called Yamamoto, the man who had put 83 American boys in the ground, the man who had cracked Marcus's glass, the man who didn't know that mathematics was about to catch up with him, Kid Brennan said. And there was something in his voice that Marcus had never heard before, something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "You've done enough." Marcus lifted the Springfield rifle. Serial number 3928471, stock scarred from melee combat, barrel still true, bolt action smooth as silk even after 6 days of coral dust and salt spray. He began the ritual of mounting the damaged scope, his fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a watchmaker, tightening the thumb screws that held the fragile optic to the rifle that everyone had called a toy. 6 days earlier they had laughed. Now nobody was laughing. The air over Peleliu shimmered like water boiling in a pot. September 15th, 1944, 9:42 in the morning. The temperature gauge on the Beachmaster's Jeep read 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was in the shade. There was no shade. The naval bombardment had stripped the vegetation from the island like a giant hand peeling skin from bone, leaving nothing but jagged white coral and black ash that stuck to everything and smelled like burning hair. Marcus stood in the staging area with 11 other men from 2nd Platoon Dog Company 1st Marine Division. His canvas rifle case lay at his feet covered in mildew and sand. The other Marines were checking their M1 Garand's 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition loaded and locked semi-automatic firepower that could put lead down range as fast as a man could pull the trigger. Marcus reached down and unbuckled the leather straps on his case. Sergeant Brennan was moving down the line, inspecting weapons, offering words that were supposed to sound encouraging, but came out like rough sandpaper on raw wood. He stopped when he reached Marcus. Stopped and stared as Marcus pulled the Springfield from its canvas shroud. The rifle was a relic, a bolt-action design from before the First World War. But it wasn't the rifle that made Brennan's eyebrows climb toward his helmet. It was the scope. The Unertl 8 power optic sat on top of the receiver like some kind of scientific instrument that had gotten lost on its way to a laboratory. 24 inches long, nearly as long as the barrel itself. It perched on delicate aluminum mounts that looked like they belonged on a surveying instrument, not a weapon of war. The steel tube was massive, comically oversized, and it caught the Pacific sunlight like a mirror. Private First Class Silas Montgomery Walsh saw it and started laughing. A harsh, bitter sound. "What in God's name is that?" Marcus didn't answer. He was too busy wiping a smudge of oil from the ocular lens with a dry cloth he kept in a waterproof pouch in his pack. The laughter spread down the line. Corporal Finn Archibald Morrison, 19 years old and fresh from a Montana ranch, shook his head slowly. Reeves planning to study the stars, maybe hunt for butterflies. "That ain't a rifle," Walsh said louder now. "That's a mail-order toy." Brennan stepped closer. His face was weathered like old leather creased from 2 campaigns and a decade of merchant marine work before that. He reached out and tapped the scope tube with one thick finger. The metallic ring echoed in the coral valley. "This thing gonna fog up in 5 minutes in this humidity," he said. "First speck of grit gets in that sliding mechanism and you got yourself a fancy club." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the white rock. "Where'd you even get this contraption?" "My father's," Marcus said quietly. He'd ordered it from a catalogue in 1938, used it for long-range target shooting. Brennan stared at him. Your daddy shoot Germans with this in the last war. My father used iron sights in France. He ordered this after he came home. Said if he'd had glass, he might have made it through without the nightmares. There was a moment of silence. Then Walsh broke it with another laugh. Well, your daddy ain't here, calculator, and we ain't shooting at paper targets. We're going into caves and spider holes. You'll be engaging the enemy at 10 feet, not 1,000 yards. They'd started calling him calculator 3 weeks into training. Marcus had a habit of writing numbers on things. Range estimations, wind corrections, elevation adjustments. He kept a notebook filled with ballistic tables and mathematical formulas that looked like something from an engineering textbook. The other men shot by instinct and experience. Marcus shot by mathematics. The nickname wasn't a compliment. Brennan looked at the scope, then at Marcus, then back at the scope. His jaw worked around the tobacco plug. Listen, kid, war ain't a math problem. It's chaos and violence and making decisions faster than you can think. That thing he tapped the scope again is fragile. It's finicky. And in about 30 seconds when we move out, it's going to be useless dead weight. Marcus set the rifle carefully on a stack of sandbags. The scope tube extended so far forward that it would hit any obstacle before the barrel did. He checked the mounts with painful precision, turning each thumb screw a fraction of a degree, making minute adjustments that the other men couldn't even see. Respectfully, Sergeant, he said, not looking up from his work. War is exactly a math problem. Trajectory is mathematics. Velocity is mathematics. Gravity is a constant. Wind is a variable. The bullet doesn't care if I'm scared or brave. It just follows the equation. Brennan stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the rest of the platoon. All right, ladies. Time to earn our pay. We're heading to the Umabrogol pocket. Intel says there's Jap positions in the ridges overlooking our supply lines. Our job is to dig them out. Stay low. Stay spread. And for Christ's sake, don't bunch up. The men moved out in a loose column, weapons at the ready. Marcus stayed behind for 30 seconds, finishing his checks. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. The cover was stained and wrinkled, filled with pencil scratches and diagrams that his father had started in France and Marcus had continued. He flipped to a page marked 800 yards and ran his finger down a column of numbers. Then he pulled out a carpenter's pencil, the kind with a flat rectangular lead that wouldn't break easily. He rolled up his left sleeve. On his forearm, just below where the fabric ended, he wrote in small, precise letters, 800Y plus 28 ELR 4 wind. Morrison had circled back, carrying his own M1 Garand, like it weighed nothing. He watched Marcus write on his skin. You planning to remember that all day, calculator? Marcus capped the pencil. Until I need it. They caught up with the platoon at the base of the first ridge. The coral here was sharp enough to cut through boot leather white as bone and twice as hard. The heat made the air shimmer and dance. Marcus could see the ridgeline 800 yards to the north. From this distance it looked peaceful. Empty. He knew better. Movement. Brennan's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried down the line like electricity through copper wire. Northern Ridge. Grid 447229. Marcus dropped to one knee behind a pile of shattered coral and pulled the Springfield tight against his shoulder. Through the unearthly scope, the world rushed toward him. The 8-power magnification collapsed the distance, erasing the heat waves and the smoke from fires still burning in the jungle. Suddenly the ridge wasn't 800 yards away. It was right there, and standing on top of it in plain sight was a Japanese officer. The man wore a pressed uniform that looked impossibly clean against the grey rock. He held binoculars in one hand and a map case in the other. To the exhausted, bleeding Marines crouching in the coral below, this officer looked like something from another world. He stood tall, unafraid. He would raise his hand, point to a cluster of rocks, and 10 seconds later, a Japanese mortar round would land exactly where he pointed. He was conducting an orchestra of death with absolute impunity. He knew exactly where the Americans were hiding, and more importantly, he knew exactly what weapons they carried. The standard American infantry rifle in 1944 was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic masterpiece, rugged and reliable, capable of putting 8 rounds downrange as fast as a man could pull the trigger. But the Garand had a limit. Effective range was 500 yards. Beyond that, the iron sights covered the entire target, and the bullet began to tumble and drift. The Japanese officer was standing at 800 yards. He had done the math. He knew he was untouchable. Marcus looked at the number written on his forearm. 800 yards. Plus 28 clicks elevation. Right 4 clicks windage. He'd calculated this shot 3 weeks ago, sitting in a tent at training camp, working through the ballistics tables his father had compiled. The .30 caliber bullet would leave the muzzle traveling at 2,800 feet per second. But gravity was constant and relentless. Over 800 yards, the bullet would drop more than 100 inches. Marcus would have to aim nearly 9 feet above the officer's head. He would have to lob the round into the air and let physics do the rest. Brennan crawled up beside him. "What are you seeing, Japanese officer?" 800 yards. He's calling in the mortar fire." 800. Brennan's voice was flat. "That's twice effective range for a Garand." "I know. Can you hit him?" Marcus didn't answer. He was already adjusting the elevation knob on top of the scope. The clicks were crisp and mechanical, tiny, precise noises in a world of explosions and screaming. Click, click, click. 28 times. Each click represented a specific angular change. Each change represented inches of bullet drop at distance. The mathematics was simple. The execution was not. The crosshair floated in the tube of glass. Marcus watched the Japanese officer through the lens. The man was smiling, confident, arrogant. He believed himself to be a god, standing on Olympus, raining destruction on mortals who couldn't reach him. Marcus checked the wind. The smoke from a burning ammunition dump was drifting across the valley floor, left to right. Maybe 5 miles an hour. He adjusted the windage knob. Click, 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 click. The crosshair moved. Sergeant Brennan was still beside him. The other men had stopped moving. They were watching, waiting. Walsh had his binoculars out, trying to see what Marcus was aiming at. Morrison was counting seconds between mortar impacts, building a rhythm of fear. "You really think you can make this shot?" Calculator Marcus took a deep breath. Let the air fill his lungs. Let his chest expand against the hard coral. Then he exhaled half of it and held the rest. The chaos of the battlefield collapsed into a single point of focus. The Japanese officer, the crosshair, the equation. His finger wrapped around the trigger. The Springfield's trigger broke like a thin rod of glass. Crisp, clean, no warning. The rifle slammed back into his shoulder with shocking violence. The recoil was nothing like a Garand. The gas operated. Garand pushed. The Springfield kicked like an angry mule. But Marcus didn't feel the bruise forming on his collarbone. He was watching the scope. This was the moment that infantrymen didn't understand. They thought a scope was just a magnifying glass attached to a rifle. They didn't know about the recoil slide. When the Springfield fired, the wooden stock drove backward, but the heavy steel tube of the unearthly scope wanted to stay still. Physics took over. The scope actually slid forward inside its aluminum rings, moving nearly 3 inches along the barrel. It looked like the gun was falling apart. But this was the genius of the design. If Marcus had been using a fixed scope, the recoil would have driven the eyepiece into his eye socket and blinded him. The unearthly slid away from his face, absorbing the shock, protecting the delicate lenses from the brutal energy of the .306 cartridge. Marcus kept his eye pressed to the rubber cup. He reached up with his right hand and manually pulled the scope backward, sliding it into battery with a soft click. It was muscle memory. Practiced 1,000 times on a range in Michigan. Shoot, slide, watch. The bullet was still in the air. At a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, the round covered the first few hundred yards almost instantly. But as it flew, the air grabbed it. Drag slowed it down. Gravity pulled it toward the earth. At 800 yards, the flight time was 1.4 seconds. 1.4 seconds is an eternity in combat. It's enough time to take a breath. Enough time to doubt your mathematics. Enough time for the target to bend down and tie his shoe and ruin everything. Marcus watched through the circle of magnified light. The Japanese officer was still smiling, still mid-sentence. His hand was raised to point at the American positions, and then the equation solved itself. The officer simply collapsed. There was no dramatic death scene, no backwards flip like in the movies. It looked like someone had cut the strings on a puppet. The man just folded in on himself and dropped straight down behind the limestone lip of the ridge. At this distance, even with 8-power magnification, Marcus couldn't see blood. There was just the sudden jarring absence of the man who had been playing God. The sound of the shot rolled back across the valley, a flat, heavy crack that echoed off the coral walls. Then silence. Absolute crushing silence. The Japanese mortar crew on the reverse slope waited for an order that would never come. The machine gun team to the left stopped firing, confused by the sudden disappearance of their commander. In the American positions, the Marines who had been mocking Marcus 10 minutes ago were frozen. They lowered their binoculars. They looked at the ridge, then they looked at the skinny kid with the glass pipe mounted on his antique rifle. Sergeant Brennan stood up slowly. His mouth was slightly open. He looked at the impossible distance, then back at Marcus. The mockery in his eyes had evaporated. It was replaced by something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Not fear of Marcus, fear of what Marcus represented. The idea that war could be reduced to trigonometry, that death could be calculated like a high school math problem. How far was that 800 yards, Sergeant? And you just calculated it in your head. Marcus was already working the bolt handle. The Springfield was slow. With a Garand, you just kept pulling the trigger. With this bolt-action relic, you had to physically unlock the breech, drag the spent casing out, and shove a new round home. His palm worked the action smooth and deliberate. The empty brass cartridge spun out and pinged against the coral. He drove a fresh round into the chamber and locked the bolt. "Yes, Sergeant, I calculated it." Brennan stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes. The pack was crushed and stained, but the cigarettes inside were still intact. He shook one loose and offered it to Marcus. This was significant. Brennan shared his smokes with nobody. Not in 2 campaigns, not even when men begged. Marcus took the cigarette even though he didn't smoke. It wasn't about tobacco. It was about respect. About crossing a line from mockery to acceptance. Kid Brennan said, lighting both cigarettes with a Zippo that had seen better days. "I was wrong about you," Marcus nodded. He took a single drag, coughed, and set the cigarette down on a sandbag. His eyes never left the scope. He was already scanning the ridge for the next target. 3 minutes later, a Japanese sergeant crawled up to check on the fallen officer. He was careful, stayed low, kept his head down. But he made one mistake. He stopped to look through the officer's binoculars. He exposed his head and shoulders for exactly 5 seconds. Marcus was already waiting. He had pre-aimed at the exact spot where the officer had fallen. The crosshair was hovering over white limestone. When the helmet appeared, Marcus didn't have to calculate anything new. He just squeezed the glass rod trigger. The second shot cracked through the humid air. The recoil slide kicked back. The scope reset. The sergeant didn't even hear the sound that killed him. The heavy .30 caliber bullet punched through his helmet and knocked him backward off the ridge like he'd been hit by an invisible truck. 2 shots. 2 kills. Both at half a mile. This time, the reaction in the American positions was different. Brennan didn't stare in confusion. He scrambled over the rocks and positioned himself beside Marcus like a bodyguard. He barked orders at the other men to keep their heads down, to not draw fire to Marcus's position. He offered Marcus his canteen. He offered him a stick of gum. Suddenly, the college kid with the mail-order toy was the most valuable asset in the platoon. Morrison crawled up with his binoculars. "Calculator. I got a machine gun nest. 600 yards. Cave mouth. Northeast quadrant." Marcus shifted position, found the target through the scope. A dark slash in the coral. He could see the glint of metal where the barrel protruded. He checked his notes. 600 yards. He adjusted elevation, adjusted windage, fired. The machine gun went silent. For the next hour, Marcus conducted a systematic dismantling of the Japanese defensive network. He wasn't just killing men. He was solving problems. A mortar position at 700 yards. A sniper hide at 550. A bunker aperture so small that rifle fire couldn't touch it. Marcus put a round through the opening and killed the gunner inside. The unertal scope, with its absurd length and fragile mounts, was proving to be the perfect tool for the grinding static warfare of Peleliu. The high magnification let him see into shadows, let him spot muzzle flash, let him pick out camouflage netting that blended perfectly with the jungle. But the weapon had limitations. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became relentless. The steel barrel grew hot enough to burn skin. Heat waves began rising off the metal, shimmering right in front of the scope lens, distorting the image like a funhouse mirror. Marcus improvised. He took a strip of burlap from a sandbag and wrapped it loosely around the barrel to break up the heat signature. He used a piece of cardboard from a ration box to make a sunshade for the objective lens, taping it on with medical tape from his first aid pouch. He looked ridiculous. A dirty, sweating Marine holding a rifle covered in rags and cardboard. But the image cleared. The killing continued. By noon, the Japanese had realized what was happening. The random deaths weren't random. They were being picked apart by a single shooter. They did what any disciplined army would do. They adapted. They stopped showing themselves. The ridge became a ghost town. Nobody stood up. Nobody looked through binoculars. They stayed deep in their caves and tunnels. The easy targets were gone. Marcus settled into a rhythm. Watch. Calculate. Breathe. Wait. The world narrowed to the circle of glass in front of his eye. The voices of the other Marines faded into background noise. The explosions became distant thunder. There was only the mathematics. Sergeant Brennan sat beside him, chewing tobacco, watching the ridge through his own binoculars. After a long silence, he spoke. "Where'd you learn to shoot like this?" Hayes Marcus didn't take his eye from the scope. My father taught me. Michigan. White-tailed deer. Your old man a Marine Army. First World War. France. Argonne Forest. There was another pause. Brennan spat into the coral. He make it home. He made it home from France. Died at Guadalcanal. August 1942. Brennan nodded slowly. He understood now. The rifle wasn't just a tool. It was a continuation. A promise kept across an ocean and 2 years of grief. He'd be proud of you, kid. Marcus said nothing, but his hands tightened slightly on the rifle. The weight of it felt heavier now, as if his father's ghost had settled into the wood and steel alongside the mathematics. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Nathaniel Garrett Holloway appeared in the trench. Yale, educated, fluent in Japanese. The kind of officer who could quote Clausewitz and actually understand what it meant. He carried a clipboard and wore the strained look of a man who'd seen intelligence reports that kept him awake at night. Hayes, got something from interrogation you need to hear. Marcus finally looked away from the scope. Holloway knelt beside him, keeping his head below the lip of the trench. We questioned the prisoners from that bunker you cleared this morning. The ones who surrendered after you killed their officer? Yes, sir. They have a name for you now. Akuma no Megane. The devil with glasses. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. A name meant they were paying attention. A name meant he'd become a problem. There's more, Holloway continued. They've put a price on information leading to your position. 1,000 yen. That's significant money for a Japanese private. Brennan swore quietly. They're hunting you specifically now. I know, Sergeant. Holloway looked at the rifle, at the scope, at the 8 empty casings lying in the coral. Do you know what this means, Hayes? You've killed 8 confirmed today. 8 men who were directing fire, coordinating defenses. You've disrupted their entire command structure in this sector. Marcus looked back through the scope at the ridge. It was still empty, still silent. With respect, sir, I've only solved 8 problems. There are more. Holloway exchanged a glance with Brennan. The kind of look that passes between men who've seen soldiers crack under pressure and soldiers who transcend it. Marcus was something else, something they didn't have a manual for. The lieutenant stood to leave, then paused. Hayes, be careful. They know about you now. They'll be coming. As if to punctuate his words, the afternoon brought a new sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping that made the ground vibrate. Brennan's weathered face went pale. Get down, now. Before Marcus could move, the ridge above them erupted with heavy machine gun fire. But this wasn't the sustained bursts of a standard weapon. This was something heavier. A Type 92 heavy machine gun firing 7.7mm rounds from a concealed position on the second ridgeline. The rounds walked across the valley like a giant's footsteps. Each impact threw up geysers of pulverized coral. They were walking the fire directly toward Marcus's last known position, trying to kill him with volume and suppression. Marcus and Brennan pressed themselves into the bottom of the trench as the world exploded around them. Razor-sharp splinters of coral whistled overhead. The concussion from each impact felt like being punched in the chest repeatedly. The noise was overwhelming, physical, a pressure that made ears ring and teeth rattle. When the firing stopped, Marcus's hands were shaking, but not from fear, from something else, a cold certainty. Because in those few seconds of terror, he'd seen something, a muzzle flash, a dark slash in the jungle canopy on the second ridgeline. The heavy gun crew had revealed themselves. He crawled back to his rifle. The scope was covered in dust, but the glass was intact. He blew the particles off the lenses and looked toward the second ridge. Hayes, what are you doing? Brennan's voice was hoarse. We need to move. They have this spot dialed in. That gun is at least 1,000 yards out, Sergeant. Maybe 1,100. Exactly. It's out of range. Let's go. Marcus settled the rifle back onto the sandbags. The manual says effective range is 900 yards, but the bullet doesn't know that. Brennan stared at him. You're not serious. They just tried to kill us. I know where they are now. Marcus. It was the first time Brennan had used his first name. That's a suicide shot. The bullet will drop 30 feet. You'll be aiming at clouds. I know. Marcus looked through the scope and found the dark slash in the jungle where the heavy gun was hiding. The problem was elevation. Even with maximum scope adjustment, he couldn't compensate for an 1,100-yard shot. He would have to use Kentucky windage, holding the crosshair high above the target and guessing the drop. He aimed at a patch of blue sky approximately 20 feet above the gun position. He was aiming at nothing, at air, at faith, at the same kind of mathematics his father had trusted when he aimed at Germans in a different war on a different continent. He exhaled. He trusted the math. He trusted the glass pipe that everyone said was a toy. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The scope slid forward and back. Marcus pulled it into battery and kept his eye on the distant jungle. But the recoil had knocked his sight picture too high. By the time he got the scope settled, all he could see was canopy. He didn't know if he had hit anything. He waited for the return fire, waited for the heavy gun to tear his position apart. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5, 10, silence. The rhythmic thumping of the Japanese heavy machine gun did not return. A cheer erupted from Morrison, who had been watching through binoculars. He saw it. Calculator got him. The gunner's down. Brennan was pounding Marcus on the back, shouting words that got lost in the ringing in Marcus's ears. Other Marines were yelling, pointing. The round had dropped out of the sky at a steep angle, plunging into the open machine gun nest like a mortar shell. 1 in a million. Impossible. But in war, impossible just means the math was harder. Marcus slumped back against the trench wall. His breath came in ragged gasps. The unearthly scope was covered in soot and coral dust. He wiped the lenses with numb fingers, checking for the cracks he knew would end everything. None. The glass remained perfect. The sun began its descent toward the Pacific, turning the sky the color of blood and fire. Somewhere in the darkening ridges the enemy was regrouping, planning. But they would be more cautious now. They knew about the devil with glasses. Marcus opened his notebook to a fresh page. 8 tally marks. 8 calculations that had saved lives. 8 problems solved. He looked at Brennan. The sergeant was sitting with his back against the trench wall, finally allowing himself to show exhaustion. "Think there's more tomorrow." Sergeant Brennan looked at the ridge, at the scope, at the skinny kid from Michigan who had just changed the mathematics of their war. "Yeah, calculator." "I think there's more." Marcus nodded. He cleaned the scope one more time, checked the mounts, verified the 0. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new equations, new distances to calculate. But tonight, for the first time since landing on Peleliu, the mortars had stopped falling on 2nd Platoon. The math had bought them one evening of peace. It was a start. Marcus woke before dawn on September 16th to the sound of Brennan coughing. The wet hacking noise that meant coral dust had gotten into lungs that had breathed too much smoke over too many campaigns. The sergeant sat with his back against the trench wall, working his jaw around phantom tobacco, staring at nothing. The unearthly scope lay between them, wrapped in its canvas case like something sacred. Marcus had cleaned it 3 times after dark, checking each lens by moonlight, running his fingers along the aluminum mount, searching for stress fractures that would mean the end of everything. The glass had survived yesterday. 8 shots. 8 kills. 1 impossible 1100-yard prayer that had silenced a heavy machine gun. But yesterday was mathematics. Today would be something else. Brennan turned his head when Marcus sat up. The older man's eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles that looked like bruises. He held out a canteen cup filled with something that might have been coffee 3 weeks ago. Now it looked like motor oil and tasted worse. "Battalion wants you to look at a bunker complex. Grid 447229. They think it's a command post." Marcus took the cup. The liquid was lukewarm and gritty. He drank it anyway. "How far?" 900 yards. "Built into the reverse slope of the northern ridge. We can't approach it without walking into a meat grinder." Marcus pulled out his notebook. The pages were stiff with salt and humidity. He flipped to the tables his father had compiled in France. 900 yards. He did the math in his head, factoring temperature and humidity, and the wind that was already picking up as the sun threatened the horizon. Bullet drop is about 230 inches at that range. That's 19 feet. Brennan stared at him. "You can hit something at 900 yards. The manual says effective range is 900 yards for a point target. I've never tried it in combat. Can you do it?" Marcus looked through the scope at the distant ridge. The bunker was barely visible, just a dark slash in the coral. But with 8 power magnification, he could make out details. A firing port, the edge of camouflage netting, movement in the shadows. "Give me 40 minutes to calculate the shot." They moved to a new position farther from where Marcus had fired yesterday. The Japanese weren't stupid. They would be looking for him, hunting the hunter. Marcus built a hide using coral rocks and a piece of shelter, half creating a shadow that would break up his outline and hide the muzzle flash. He stacked sandbags to support the long rifle, making sure the unearthly's tube had clearance. The scope was so long that it would strike any obstacle before the barrel did. Every position had to be engineered. Then he went to work with his notebook. 900 yards. Temperature already 95 degrees and the sun hadn't cleared the ridge. Humidity near saturation. He licked his finger and held it up, feeling the breeze. Wind quartering from the southeast at maybe 7 miles per hour. He wrote the numbers on his forearm in grease pencil. The skin there was already covered in faded calculations from yesterday. His left arm was becoming a database of death. Each number a life ended. Each equation a problem solved. Brennan watched him work. You really do treat this like a math problem. It is a math problem, Sergeant. Gravity is a constant. Wind is a variable. Temperature affects air density. The equation doesn't care if I'm scared. Are you scared? Marcus looked up from his calculations every single time. He settled behind the rifle and began the slow, methodical process of stalking a target he could barely see. Through the scope, the bunker entrance became clear. He could see the sandbags, the firing port, the glint of metal inside, a helmet, maybe two. He waited. 30 minutes. Nothing moved. The sun climbed higher. Sweat ran into Marcus's eyes, stinging, blurring his vision. The coral dug into his elbows like broken glass. Brennan sat beside him, patient, chewing nothing, just working his jaw in the rhythm of a habit that wouldn't die. Then a figure appeared in the bunker entrance. An officer. The uniform was too clean, too pressed. He was shouting orders to someone inside, gesturing with a map case. Marcus had already dialed in the elevation. 28 clicks up. Wind correction 3 clicks right. He placed the crosshair on a point in empty space, approximately 18 feet above the officer's head. He was aiming at the sky. He exhaled half a breath. Everything outside the circle of glass ceased to exist. The officer was still visible, still shouting, still alive for exactly 1.6 more seconds. Marcus squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. The scope slid forward, absorbing recoil, protecting the glass. Marcus worked the bolt without thinking, muscle memory taking over. Eject, load, lock. He watched through the glass as the officer suddenly stumbled backward and disappeared into the bunker. 2 seconds later, the bunker erupted with activity. Men poured out confused, leaderless. And then, something Marcus hadn't expected. A white flag. A piece of cloth tied to a rifle barrel waving from the bunker entrance like surrender was something the Japanese army had forgotten how to do until mathematics reminded them. Brennan grabbed the radio handset. Actual, this is Brennan.
Enemy position grid. 447229 is showing white flag. Repeat white flag.
The radio crackled. Verify and hold position. Over the next 20 minutes, 47 Japanese soldiers emerged from that bunker complex with their hands raised. 47 men who would have fought to the death, surrendering because their commander had been killed by a bullet that dropped from the sky at an angle so steep they thought it was artillery. Lieutenant Holloway appeared an hour later. He was young for a lieutenant, maybe 28, with the strained look of a man carrying knowledge he didn't want. He walked back from processing the prisoners with his helmet in his hands. Corporal Hayes. The prisoners say their commander was killed by a sniper. They thought it was artillery at first because the angle was so steep. He paused, looked at the rifle, at the scope, at Marcus. How far was that shot? 900 yards, sir. Holloway shook his head slowly like a man trying to dislodge water from his ears. That's not possible. Marcus said nothing. The rifle spoke for itself. Serial number 3928471, the glass pipe, the mail order toy, the hand of God. Holloway pulled out a small notebook of his own. I need to show you something from the interrogation. We've been questioning prisoners all morning. They keep mentioning a name. A Japanese sniper who's been assigned specifically to hunt American snipers. Marcus felt ice in his stomach. What name the prisoners call him? Yamamoto. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto. Scout sniper, Japanese Army. They say he's killed 83 Americans. They say he's being brought to this sector specifically because of you. How do they know about me? Holloway's expression was grim. Because yesterday you killed their officers at ranges they didn't think were possible. You disrupted their entire command network. You made yourself a problem, and the Japanese solve problems. Brennan swore quietly. They're hunting you specifically now, kid. I know, Sergeant. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The afternoon brought proof. At 1300 hours, Marcus was scanning the northern ridgeline when Morrison shouted a warning. Flash second ridge, northeast quadrant. Marcus didn't have time to think. He threw himself sideways as something cracked through the air where his head had been a heartbeat before. The round struck the sandbag behind him with a wet thump and kept going, punching through 3 bags before embedding itself in coral. Brennan was already moving, dragging Marcus deeper into the trench. That was incoming sniper. Marcus's hands went to his helmet. There was a crease along the right side, fresh, deep enough to see metal. The Japanese round had grazed him at a range that had to be over 1,000 yards. He's here, Morrison said, his voice tight. Yamamoto is here. And he missed, Marcus said quietly. I won't. For the next 3 hours, it became a different kind of war. Not mass combat, not artillery barrages, just 2 men with rifles hunting each other across a valley of white coral and black shadow. Cat and mouse, calculator and killer. Marcus relocated 4 times. Each time he would set up, scan the ridges, fire 2 or 3 shots at targets of opportunity, then move before Yamamoto could triangulate his position. Each time he moved, he imagined the Japanese sniper doing the same thing. 2 predators circling, 2 mathematicians calculating angles and distances and the probability of death. Morrison became Marcus's eyes, spotting with binoculars while Marcus focused through the scope. Walsh positioned himself as a bodyguard, his Thompson submachine gun ready for close threats. The men who had mocked Marcus 48 hours ago were now protecting him like he was artillery personified. At 1500 hours, Marcus spotted movement at 1,050 yards. A muzzle flash in a crevice that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide a man. He didn't know if it was Yamamoto or another sniper, but the technique was professional, controlled, deliberate. Marcus adjusted elevation, adjusted windage, fired. Through the scope he saw a helmet tumble out of the crevice and clatter down the rocks. One less problem, but not Yamamoto. The Japanese sergeant was too good to expose himself like that. The sun moved across the sky. Marcus's tally grew. A machine gun nest at 700 yards, a mortar observer at 820, a sniper hide at 600. Each shot was a calculation. Each calculation was a life ended. The numbers on his arm multiplied like cancer. By 1600 hours he'd added 12 more kills. 20 total since landing on Peleliu. 20 men who would never go home. 20 families who would receive telegrams that started with the words, "We regret to inform you." Marcus didn't let himself think about that. He thought about mathematics, about windage and elevation, about the next problem, because if he thought about the faces, he would stop calculating. And if he stopped calculating, more Americans would die. Private First Class Everett Gideon Cross appeared in the trench as the sun began its descent. Cross was 22, a wheat farmer's son from Kansas with a radio strapped to his back and a Bible in his pocket. He had gentle eyes that didn't match the rifle in his hands. Calculator, Cross said, kneeling beside Marcus. "Captain needs you to coordinate with artillery. We got targets on the eastern ridge that are too deep for you to reach." "You spot, I call fire." Marcus nodded. For the next hour they worked in tandem. Marcus would identify a target through the unearthly scope, calculate the precise grid coordinates, and Cross would relay them to the artillery battery 2 miles behind the lines. It was a strange partnership. Physics and faith, mathematics and prayer. Cross adjusted the radio, his voice calm and measured as he called in fire missions. "This is Dog 2, fire mission, grid 451237. Suspected mortar position. Repeat, suspected mortar position." The radio crackled. Roger, Dog 2, shot out. 30 seconds later, shells screamed overhead and impacted exactly where Marcus had directed. The ridge erupted in smoke and shrapnel. When it cleared, the mortar position was silent. Cross looked at Marcus with something like awe. "It's like a physics problem, ain't it?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The first one in 2 days. Deadly physics. They worked together until the light began to fail. 6 more targets identified, 6 more fire missions called. The partnership was efficient, elegant. It felt like Marcus had found someone who understood that war wasn't chaos. It was mathematics expressed in violence. As darkness fell, Cross shared his rations with Marcus. Crackers that tasted like cardboard and cheese that looked like plastic. They ate in silence, listening to the distant sound of artillery and the closer sound of men digging in for another night. "My sister wants to be an engineer," Cross said quietly. "Columbia University. She's smarter than me by half." Marcus looked at him. "You should tell her to go. After the war, I write her every week. Tell her to study hard. Tell her the world's going to need smart folks to rebuild after we finish breaking it." There was something in Cross's voice. Something that sounded like hope mixed with resignation. Like he knew he might not make it home to see his sister graduate. Like he was trying to leave something behind besides a folded flag. Marcus wanted to say something reassuring, wanted to tell Cross that the math said they'd both survive. But he'd learned in 2 days that mathematics only worked on bullets, not on fate. The night brought new intelligence. Holloway appeared with a flashlight covered in red cellophane, keeping the light dim enough not to draw fire. "Hayes, we've been monitoring Japanese radio traffic. They're bringing in reinforcements tomorrow. Armor. Tanks type 95 light tanks. 2 of them. 37mm main gun. Hull-mounted machine guns. They're planning to punch through our lines at dawn." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Tanks. A .30 caliber rifle against armor plating was like throwing rocks at a battleship. Brennan voiced what Marcus was thinking. "What do you want Calculator to do about tanks, Lieutenant? He's got a sniper rifle, not a bazooka." Holloway's expression was grim. "I know. But if anyone can find a weakness, it's Hayes. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in the trench with his notebook sketching diagrams of Type 95 tanks by moonlight. The armor was thin compared to American Sherman's. 12 millimeters on the hull, 16 on the turret. But thin didn't mean penetrable, not for a rifle round. He thought about weak points, vision slits, hatches. Anywhere the armor had to be thinner for functionality. The problem was hitting a moving target. A tank rolling over uneven terrain at 10 miles per hour was a different equation than a stationary officer at 800 yards. Brennan woke him at 0400. Marcus hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep over his calculations. The notebook was covered in sketches and numbers that looked like the work of a man losing his mind. They're coming. The ground shook with a vibration that rattled teeth. Not explosions. Something mechanical. A low, grinding noise that sounded like the earth itself was being torn apart. Marcus grabbed the Springfield and moved to his position. 2 Japanese Type 95 light tanks clanked around the bend in the valley. They were ugly, boxy machines painted in yellow and brown camouflage. Small compared to American Shermans, but against infantry with no anti-tank weapons, they were invincible. Their 37mm main guns swiveled searching. Their hull-mounted machine guns sprayed the American lines with reckless hatred. The sound was overwhelming, mechanical and organic at once, like metal dinosaurs hunting prey. The Marines opened up with everything they had. M1 Garans pinged harmlessly off steel armor. Grenades exploded uselessly against the tracks. The tanks ignored the small arms fire like elephants ignoring mosquitoes. Brennan was screaming for a bazooka team, but the bazookas were gone, out of ammunition or destroyed or buried with their operators somewhere in the white coral. Marcus watched the lead tank through his scope. It wasn't buttoned up. The commander's hatch was open. A Japanese officer stood in the turret exposed from the chest up, shouting into a headset. It was the same arrogance Marcus had seen 3 days ago. The same belief that American infantry was suppressed, broken, unable to touch them. Marcus centered the crosshair on the tank commander, but the problem was movement. The tank was bouncing over uneven ground, lurching violently. The commander bobbed up and down like a cork in rough water. Every time Marcus tried to track him, the narrow field of view lost the target. He did something that made Brennan gasp. He reached up and adjusted the magnification ring on the unearthel, dialing it down from 8 power to 4. The image got smaller, but the field of view widened. Now he could see the whole tank. Now he could see the rhythm of the bounce. The suspension compressed and rebounded. Up, down, up, down. Marcus had to time the shot. Fire at the top of the bounce. That split second where inertia hung the tank in the air before gravity pulled it back down. He led the target. Placed the crosshair 2 feet in front of the commander's face. Waited for the tank to climb over a pile of rubble. The nose pitched up. The commander rose into the crosshair. Marcus fired. The bullet struck the commander in the side of the helmet. The man disappeared into the turret as if yanked by an invisible cable. The tank swerved violently left, crashing into a limestone wall. The engine sputtered and died. It sat there, smoking, disabled by a single rifle round and mathematics. But the second tank didn't stop. It roared past its crippled partner, accelerating toward the Marine lines. This commander had learned. His hatch was closed, buttoned up tight, a rolling steel coffin with no target to shoot, 400 yards and closing fast. Marcus scanned desperately through the scope. The armor was impenetrable to rifle fire. The tracks were moving too fast to hit. Then he saw it. The gunner's optic. A small glass circle next to the main gun barrel, maybe the size of a teacup saucer. If he could shatter that glass, the gunner would be blind. The tank was 300 yards away. The main gun fired. The shell exploded against the trench wall 10 feet from Marcus, showering him with dirt and hot shrapnel. Blood trickled from his nose from the concussion. He wiped it away and settled back behind the rifle. He placed the crosshair on the tiny glass eye and squeezed. The shot sparked off the turret armor. A miss by inches. Marcus worked the bolt frantically. The tank was 200 yards away now. Machine gun rounds chewed up the sandbags around him. Brennan was firing his Thompson in a useless gesture of defiance. Marcus fired again. White dust puffed exactly on the optic. Glass shattered. The turret stopped turning. The main gun froze, pointing uselessly to the right. Without the gunner's sight, the tank was just a battering ram. The Marines swarmed it. Morrison jammed grenades into vision slits. Walsh threw a satchel charge onto the engine deck. The explosion rocked the valley. The second tank ground to a halt, burning. Marcus slumped against the trench wall. His whole body trembled. Adrenaline draining away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and the copper taste of fear. The unearthel scope was covered in soot and coral dust. But when he checked the glass with shaking fingers, it remained perfect. The fragile glass pipe had just killed 2 tanks. Brennan sat down beside him heavily. The sergeant's hands were shaking too. They stayed like that for a long time. 2 men who had just seen the impossible become routine. But the destruction of the tanks had consequences Marcus didn't anticipate. Lieutenant Holloway appeared an hour later with a face like thunder. Hayes. The Japanese know what you did. Radio intercepts confirm it. You just crossed a line. You moved from nuisance to genuine threat. Marcus looked at him. What does that mean, sir? It means they're done trying to hunt you with snipers. They're bringing everything they have. As if summoned by prophecy, a sound rose from the jungle. A sound that turned blood to ice water and made even veterans go pale. Tenno Heika Banzai. 10,000 voices. 10,000 men screaming for their emperor. The cry started as a whisper, then grew to a roar that echoed off the coral ridges. Brennan's face went white. Banzai charge. Fixed bayonets. The Marines locked their long steel blades onto the ends of their M1 Garands. They braced themselves against the trench walls. They knew what was coming. Hand-to-hand combat. Brutal. Intimate. Bloody. Marcus looked down at his Springfield. It had a bayonet lug, but the thought of mounting a blade on a rifle with a 2-foot precision scope was insane. The vibration of stabbing someone would shatter the optics. The rifle was too long, too heavy, too fragile for what was about to happen. He made a decision that felt like cutting off his own arm. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrench he carried for the scope mounts. With trembling fingers he loosened the thumb screws. He slid the inertial scope off the rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. 24 inches of glass and steel that had kept him alive for 3 days. He didn't toss it aside. He wrapped it carefully in the canvas case with the same care a father might wrap a newborn child. Then he shoved it deep under the heavy sandbags at the bottom of the trench, burying it like treasure. Brennan watched him. His voice was quiet. You going to be okay without it? Marcus stood up. He was just a rifleman now. A bolt-action rifle with iron sights and 5 rounds in the magazine. He looked at Brennan and nodded. My father fought without glass at the Argonne. I can too. The first wave of Japanese soldiers hit the wire at a dead run. The machine guns tore them apart, but more came behind, climbing over the bodies. They were 50 yards away, then 30, then 10. Marcus fired his iron-sighted rifle as fast as he could work the bolt. He dropped a man at 20 yards, another at 10. The muzzle flash burned his eyes. The rifle cracked against his shoulder again and again. Then the wave crashed into the trench and mathematics became irrelevant. A Japanese soldier vaulted over the parapet and landed directly on top of Marcus. The impact drove the air from his lungs. The soldier raised his rifle to drive the bayonet down. Marcus brought the stock of the Springfield up with desperate strength, smashing it into the man's jaw. Wood cracked. The soldier fell backward. Marcus scrambled to his feet, working the bolt. He fired from the hip. The muzzle blast singed the soldier's uniform at point-blank range. The trench became hell. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing, gouging, screaming. There was no strategy, no windage adjustments, no calculations, just the oldest equation of all: kill or be killed. Marcus fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He used the rifle as a club when there was no time to reload. He used his trench knife, 6 inches of steel his father had carried in France. The blade that had killed Germans now killed Japanese. He fought until his arms felt like lead and his lungs burned. Brennan stayed close, the big sergeant fighting like a demon, keeping enemies away from Marcus's blind spots. They fought back to back, 2 men against a tide of violence. And then Marcus heard Everett Cross scream. He turned in time to see the Kansas farm boy go down under a Japanese soldier's bayonet. The blade punched through Cross's chest and came out his back. Cross's eyes went wide, not with pain, with surprise. Marcus shot the Japanese soldier, worked the bolt, shot another, fought his way to Cross and dropped to his knees beside him. Cross's hands clutched at the wound. Blood poured between his fingers. Too much blood. The kind of bleeding that mathematics couldn't stop. Tell my sister, Cross whispered. His voice was wet, bubbling. Tell her Columbia. Engineering school. She's so smart. Marcus pressed his hands over the wound, trying to stop what couldn't be stopped. I'll tell her, I promise. Cross smiled. It was the saddest thing Marcus had ever seen. Like a physics problem, right? Even this. The angle. The force. All just numbers. His eyes went distant, fixed on something Marcus couldn't see. The radio on his back crackled with static, unanswered calls from artillery positions that would never receive coordinates again. Marcus felt something break inside him, something that had held together through 3 days of calculated killing. He stood up, picked up his rifle. and the mathematician became something else entirely. For the next 4 minutes, Marcus killed with a fury that had no room for numbers. 10 Japanese soldiers fell to rifle fire knife work and rage. Morrison and Walsh had to physically drag him away from a pile of bodies. The wave broke. The surviving Japanese retreated into the smoke and jungle. The trench was filled with the dead and dying. The living sat in shocked silence, covered in blood and coral dust. Marcus collapsed onto an ammunition crate. His hands were covered in Cross's blood. They wouldn't stop shaking. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Then he remembered the scope. He dropped to his knees and began digging through the sandbags with frantic hands. Brennan helped him, both men throwing aside the heavy bags until they found the canvas case. Marcus unwrapped it as if it were made of butterfly wings. The unearthed scope was there, clean, safe, perfect. He held it up to the fading light. The glass was clear. The spider silk crosshair was intact. Relief washed over him so powerfully his eyes stung. But it felt wrong. Cross was dead. 20 other Marines were dead. And all Marcus could feel was gratitude that Glass had survived. Brennan sat down heavily beside him, a fresh bandage wrapped around his head, blood soaking through. He looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen too much. "You keep that thing safe, kid. Tomorrow we got more work." Marcus nodded. He carefully remounted the scope on the battered rifle, tightening the screws with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He checked the alignment. Still zeroed. The sun set over Peleliu, turning the sky blood red. Somewhere in the darkening ridges, Yamamoto was waiting, planning, calculating his own equations of death. But tomorrow was another day, another set of problems to solve. Marcus added 28 tally marks to his notebook, brought the total to 36 confirmed kills in 3 days, 36 problems solved, and 1 loss that no mathematics could calculate away. September 20th, 1944. The day after Everett Gideon Cross died in Marcus Elijah Hayes's arms. The sun rose over Peleliu like it had every morning for 6 days, indifferent to the mathematics of grief. Marcus sat in the trench with his back against coral that had absorbed so much blood it looked rust-coloured in the dawn light. His hands were clean now. He'd scrubbed them raw the night before using sand and seawater until his knuckles bled. But he could still feel Cross's blood. The phantom weight of it. The warmth draining away as the Kansas farm boy whispered about his sister and Columbia University and dreams that would never calculate into reality. The unearthly scope lay across Marcus's lap. He'd cleaned it 3 times after dark, checking each lens by moonlight, searching for new cracks that would mean the end. The diagonal scar from Yamamoto's bullet 3 days ago was still there, frozen in the glass like a promise. The Japanese sniper had marked him, had come within inches of ending the equation, had proven that even the best calculator could be calculated against. Marcus had killed 86 men in 5 days. The number was written in his notebook in neat handwriting that looked like it belonged to an accountant, tracking inventory, not a 20-year-old tracking corpses. 86 problems solved. But last night, during the Banzai charge, mathematics had failed. 18 more kills in 4 minutes of animal fury. Rifle, knife, fists. The calculator becoming something his father would not have recognized. 104 total now. The number felt obscene. A century of death. A milestone that deserved nothing but silence. Sergeant Cole Thaddeus Brennan appeared with the dawn moving slowly, like a man who'd aged a decade overnight. The bandage around his head was fresh but already soaking through. He carried 2 canteen cups of something that might have been coffee in 1943. Now it looked like muddy water and tasted worse. "Battalion wants the eastern positions cleared," Brennan said, his voice rough. 4 bunkers, 700 to 900 yards. "But that's not why I'm here." Marcus looked up. The sergeant's eyes were bloodshot, ringed with exhaustion and something deeper. Guilt, maybe. The kind that came from surviving when younger men didn't. "Holloway has intel on Yamamoto. Confirmed position, 1,350 yards, northern high ground." Marcus felt ice settle in his stomach. 1,350. That was beyond impossible. That was prayer disguised as ballistics. "That's 400 yards past effective range," Marcus said quietly. "Bullet drop at that distance is almost 40 feet. I'd be aiming at clouds." "I know." Brennan sat down heavily. "And I'm not ordering you to take it. Hell, I'm not even asking." He paused. "I'm telling you it exists. What you do with that information is between you and whatever God you calculate for." Marcus looked at the scope, at the crack running through the glass, at the rifle that had killed more men than some infantry companies. His father's voice echoed in memory. "You're not a shooter, son. You're a calculator. But what happened when the equation became impossible? What happened when mathematics met faith, and neither could guarantee the answer? How much time do I have? Hour. Maybe 2. Then we're moving north. Battalion's pulling us off the line tomorrow. First Division's been chewed up. 3,000 men landed. Less than 1,000 walking off. Cross won't be one of them. No. Brennan's voice was soft. He won't. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher and the heat began building toward the daily crescendo of 115 degrees. Other Marines moved past, hollow-eyed and mechanical, going through motions that had become ritual. Check weapons, fill canteens, write letters that might never be mailed. Corporal Finn Archibald Morrison appeared with his binoculars and a face that looked 10 years older than his 19 years. Calculator. I can see the position. Rock overhang on the northern ridge. Natural camouflage. Can't see the shooter, but I spotted barrel glint. Twice. He's there. Marcus pulled out his notebook. The pages were stiff with humidity and blood and the accumulated weight of 6 days in hell. He flipped to a blank page and began the calculations. 1,350 yards. Temperature already 98 degrees. Humidity near saturation. Wind quartering from the southeast at approximately 8 miles per hour. The mathematics were brutal. At that range, the bullet would be in flight for over 2 seconds. Gravity would pull it down more than 36 feet. Wind drift would push it nearly 40 inches. The target was a shadow in rocks that Marcus couldn't even see clearly through 8-power magnification. He would be shooting at a ghost, at probability, at the slim margin between mathematics and miracle. For 30 minutes, Marcus filled pages with equations, bullet drop tables, wind calculations, temperature effects on air density, the Coriolis effect at extreme range. He factored variables that most snipers didn't know existed, built a mathematical model that would have impressed physics professors at universities he'd never attend. But physics was theory. This was reality, and reality had a way of making theories bleed. Private First Class. Silas Montgomery Walsh arrived with ammunition and a Thompson submachine gun he carried like a talisman. The Tennessee coal miner's son had appointed himself Marcus's bodyguard after the tank battle, had taken it personally when Marcus saved his life by calculating mortar trajectories before the Japanese crews could fire a second salvo. "You really gonna try this shot?" "Calculator." Marcus looked up from his notebook. His eyes were red from lack of sleep and the coral dust that got into everything. "I don't know yet. What's holding you back?" "Math not working, math's working fine." Marcus showed him the calculations. The equation balances. Bullet drop wind, drift every variable accounted for. The mathematics are perfect. So what's the problem? Cross didn't die from bad mathematics. He died from good courage. Marcus's voice was flat, empty. "I'm wondering if there's a difference worth calculating." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Then Cross died because some Japanese bastard stuck a bayonet in him. You put a bullet in that bastard 3 seconds later. The math worked fine. It just didn't work fast enough. It never does." By 0900 hours, Marcus had made his decision. Not because the mathematics were certain, because uncertainty was just another variable and he'd learned to calculate with those too. He moved to a new position on the western approach, building a hide from coral rocks and a shelter half that created shadow without silhouette. Morrison set up 30 yards to his right with binoculars. Walsh positioned himself behind with the Thompson. Brennan stayed close, not speaking, just present. The old sergeant understood that some calculations required witnesses. Marcus mounted the unearthly scope on the Springfield with the ritual precision of a priest preparing sacrament. He checked each mount screw, verified the elevation and windage knobs, tested the recoil slide mechanism. The crack in the objective lens caught sunlight, a diagonal scar that shouldn't exist, but did. Yamamoto's mark, a reminder that even calculators could be hunted. Through the scope, the northern ridge looked impossibly distant. Marcus could see the rock overhang Morrison had described, could see shadows that might hide a man, or might be nothing. At 1,350 yards, even 8-power magnification compressed details into ambiguity. He would be aiming 30 feet above that shadow, at empty sky, at clouds and faith, and the accumulated weight of everything his father had taught him about trajectories and trust. Marcus pulled out his grease pencil and wrote on his left forearm. The skin there was covered in faded calculations from 5 days of killing, no clean space left. He wrote over old numbers, layering mathematics like a palimpsest of death. 1350y plus 42 ELL, 6 wind, cross, /dad, /all. Brennan saw the notation, saw Cross's name written in grease pencil alongside range and windage. The sergeant's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Some equations transcended ballistics. Morrison called out ranges and conditions. Wind steady at 8 miles per hour, temperature 104 and climbing, target area partially shaded, no movement visible. Marcus settled behind the rifle. The coral dug into his elbows like broken glass. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging, blurring. He blinked it away and found the target area through the scope. The shadow. The possibility. The ghost he was about to shoot at with mathematics as his only certainty. He adjusted the elevation knob. Click, click, click. 42 times. Each click represented a specific angular change. Each change represented inches of drop at distance. The mathematics was simple. The faith required was not. Wind correction next. 6 clicks left, compensating for drift that would push the bullet nearly 3 feet off course during its 2.1-second flight. Marcus placed the crosshair on a wisp of cloud approximately 30 feet above the target area. He was aiming at nothing. At air. At the same kind of impossible shot his father might have attempted in France if he'd had glass instead of iron sights. His breathing slowed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm his father had taught him while hunting whitetail in Michigan forests that felt like they belonged to a different universe now. "You don't have to take this shot," Brennan said quietly. "Nobody expects the impossible." Marcus thought about Cross dying while talking about his sister, about his father dying at Guadalcanal before teaching him everything he needed to know, about Yamamoto out there with his own notebook full of identical calculations, hunting Americans with the same cold precision Marcus used to hunt Japanese. 2 calculators, 1 equation. Mathematics as the language of death spoken fluently by both sides. "Yes," Marcus said, his eye pressed to the scope. "I do have to take it." His hands steadied. The tremor that had plagued him since Cross died smoothed into the mechanical calm of pure calculation. Fear was just another variable. Grief was wind drift. Doubt was a correction factor. The world narrowed to the circle of glass, the crosshair floating in empty sky. The mathematics and faith merged into a single point of inevitability. "This is for Cross," Marcus whispered. "For Dad. For everyone who died while I calculated how to keep them alive and failed." He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared. The recoil slammed into his shoulder with familiar violence. The unearthal scope slid forward in its mounts, the mechanism absorbing energy that would have shattered fixed optics. Marcus pulled the scope back into battery by reflex muscle memory taking over. He kept his eye pressed to the rubber cup, watching, waiting. The bullet was in flight, 2.1 seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats and hope. At 1,350 yards, the round was barely visible even in perfect conditions. Marcus couldn't track it, couldn't see it arc through the air in the parabolic curve that physics demanded. He could only watch the target area and wait for confirmation or failure. 1 second. Nothing. 2 seconds. Still nothing. Morrison had his binoculars locked on the target. His voice was tight. "Can't see impact. Too far. Too much shadow." Marcus worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered a fresh round. His hands moved automatically while his mind calculated probabilities. At this range, a 6-inch error in wind estimation meant a complete miss. A 2-degree error in elevation meant hitting rock 10 feet above or below the target. The mathematics said he'd done everything right. Reality wasn't required to agree. Then Morrison's voice cut through the silence. "Wait. Movement. Someone's... calculator. Someone just fell. Backward. Into the hide. I saw arms, legs, a body going down." Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe. "Are you sure there's..." Morrison adjusted his binoculars. "There's blood on the rocks now. Fresh. Bright red. It wasn't there 3 seconds ago." Walsh was pounding Marcus on the back, shouting something about impossible shots and divine intervention. Brennan sat perfectly still, staring at the distant ridge with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been fear of what mathematics could accomplish when pushed past breaking. Marcus lowered the rifle slowly. His hands were shaking again. Not from adrenaline, from the weight of what he'd just done. 1,350 yards, 36 feet of bullet drop. A target he couldn't even see clearly. Mathematics meeting faith at the intersection of impossible. But he needed confirmation. Needed to know if the equation had balanced, or if Morrison had seen shadows and hope instead of reality. "We wait," Marcus said quietly. "If Yamamoto is down, the Japanese will react. If I missed, he'll relocate, and we'll never find him again." They waited. 10 minutes that felt like hours. The sun climbed higher. The heat built. Marcus watched through the scope, scanning the target area for any sign of movement, any proof that mathematics had won. Then it came. Not from the northern ridge, from the valley below. A Japanese patrol moving fast, heading toward Yamamoto's position. 6 men. No, 8. Officers, judging by the way they moved. Urgent. Responding to something. Morrison saw them too. Calculator.
Patrol heading to the high ground. Double time. That's not normal movement.
Marcus tracked them through the scope as they climbed the northern ridge. Watched them disappear into the rock overhang where Yamamoto had been hiding. 30 seconds later, 4 of them emerged carrying something between them. A body. Limp. One arm hanging loose. They were carrying their sniper out. Marcus had hit him. 1,350 yards. The impossible shot. The equation that shouldn't have balanced but did. Morrison was shouting. Walsh was laughing. Brennan was shaking his head slowly like a man watching the rules of physics rewrite themselves in real time. But Marcus felt nothing. No triumph. No relief. Just the hollow certainty that he'd solved another problem by creating another corpse. That the mathematics worked even when he wished they wouldn't. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. Kill number 105. Range 1,350 yards. Conditions SE wind 8 miles per hour. Temperature 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Target Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto. Result confirmed hit carried out by patrol. The handwriting was neat. Precise. The handwriting of an accountant who'd just balanced a ledger written in blood. 3 days later, the mathematics proved more complicated than Marcus had calculated. September 23rd. The 1st Marine Division was being pulled off Peleliu. The island had chewed through 3,000 men and spit out less than 1,000 who could still walk. The remaining Japanese had retreated into caves where they would hold out for another 2 months. But the Marines were done. Used up. Hollowed out. Marcus stood in a makeshift POW camp, following Lieutenant Nathaniel Garrett Holloway through rows of wounded Japanese soldiers. The lieutenant's face was drawn older than his 28 years. He carried a folder that looked like it had been read many times. Hayes. There's someone you need to meet. They stopped at a tent, where a Japanese soldier sat with his right shoulder wrapped in bloody bandages. The man's eyes were dark and intelligent, alert despite obvious pain. He looked at Marcus with an expression that wasn't hatred. It was something closer to recognition. "This is Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto," Holloway said quietly. "He was captured yesterday during a patrol near the northern ridge. Severe damage to his right shoulder from a rifle round. He says he was shot 3 days ago from an impossible distance." Marcus felt his breath catch. Yamamoto wasn't dead. The 1,350-yard shot hadn't killed him, had only wounded. The mathematics had solved the problem, but not the way Marcus had calculated. Holloway had brought a translator, a Nisei corporal who spoke both languages. The translator nodded to Yamamoto, who began speaking in Japanese. His voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man who understood that war was mathematics, and both sides spoke the same language. "He says, you are Akuma no Megane, the devil with glasses. He says he tracked you for 5 days. He says he put 83 American soldiers in the ground before you found him at a range he measured after as 1,347 yards. Marcus said nothing. Just looked at the man who had cracked his scope, who had tried to kill him a dozen times, who had failed by margins measured in inches, and now sat wounded because Marcus's margins had been slightly better. Yamamoto spoke again, longer this time. The translator's expression shifted to something like awe. "He wants to know your total. How many you killed?" 105 confirmed, Marcus said quietly. His voice was flat, empty. The translator relayed this. Yamamoto's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or the professional acknowledgement of a craftsman recognizing superior work. Yamamoto reached into his pocket, slowly, carefully watched by guards with rifles. He pulled out a small notebook. It looked exactly like Marcus's. Blood-stained, water-damaged, filled with the accumulated knowledge of a calculator who had learned his trade through trial and death. He held it out. The translator spoke. "He says this is for you. So you understand you were not fighting a monster. You were fighting a calculator, like yourself. He says the mathematics are universal. Bullet drop does not care about flags or emperors or presidents. Only angles and gravity and wind." Marcus took the notebook, opened it. The pages were filled with Japanese characters he couldn't read, but the numbers were identical to his own. Range tables, wind calculations, elevation adjustments. 2 men, 2 wars, two sets of equations that had collided in coral and blood. Yamamoto spoke again. The translator continued. He says he has never seen a calculator become something else. He watched you during the banzai charge, saw you put down the glass and fight with a knife. He says this is why you won, because you could calculate and still feel. He could only calculate. Marcus's throat tightened. He thought about Cross dying, about the 18 kills in 4 minutes when mathematics disappeared and only fury remained. Tell him, Marcus said slowly, that I wish the mathematics had been wrong, that I wish 1,350 yards was impossible, that I wish we'd both missed every shot and gone home to teach other people how numbers work when they don't kill. The translator relayed this. Yamamoto listened, then spoke one final time. He says the mathematics are never wrong, only the wars that require them. He says to tell Cross's sister that her brother died with honor, that mathematics could not save him from courage, and that you should teach her the equations anyway, because the world will need calculators who remember that numbers represent lives, not just problems. Marcus looked at Yamamoto for a long moment. 2 calculators, 188 kills between them, 83 and 105. The mathematics of mutual destruction expressed in neat handwriting and blood-stained notebooks. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between men who understood that excellence and horror could coexist in the same equation. Outside the tent, Marcus opened Yamamoto's notebook to the last page. There, written in careful English, were 4 words: worthy opponent. Teach them better. Marcus closed the notebook and walked back toward his unit. The war continued around him, but something fundamental had shifted. The weight on his chest hadn't disappeared. It never would. But it had changed from the crushing pressure of mathematical certainty into something more complex. The understanding that equations could be correct and horrifying simultaneously, that solving problems sometimes created worse ones, that the best calculator wasn't the one with the most kills, but the one who knew when to set down the rifle and pick up the chalk. October 15th, 1944. The transport ship pulled away from Peleliu, leaving behind an island that would haunt 1,000 men for the rest of their lives. Marcus stood on deck with his rifle wrapped in canvas, watching white coral and black ash disappear into Pacific blue. An armorer approached. Serial number 3928471. This weapon needs to be catalogued for the museum division. Marcus unwrapped the canvas slowly. The Springfield looked like it had survived hell because it had. Stock gouged from melee combat. Barrel worn from 105 calculated murders. But the inertial scope remained perfect, except for the diagonal crack from Yamamoto's bullet. The scar that proved even the best calculators could be calculated against. This one's got a history, the armorer said, making notes. Marcus handed over the rifle. It felt like amputating part of himself, like saying goodbye to his father a second time. He walked away with empty hands and 2 notebooks. His own filled with 105 tally marks. Yamamoto's filled with 83 and a final message about teaching better mathematics. December 1944. Michigan. Snow falling on a cemetery where his father had been buried 2 years earlier. George Hayes, 1898 to 1942. Guadalcanal. Marcus knelt in snow that soaked through his uniform trousers. He placed his silver star on the frozen ground. Next to it, his notebook. 105 confirmed kills. Peleliu, September 15th through October 15th, 1944. I finished the math. Dad. His voice cracked in winter silence. I used the glass just like you said. I became the calculator you knew I'd be. The wind blew through bare trees. Marcus pulled his coat tighter. But the numbers have faces now. Cross's face. Yamamoto's face. All 105 of them. And I don't know if that means the mathematics worked or failed. His father's headstone offered no answers. Just cold granite and the equation of grief that couldn't be expressed in ballistic tables. What followed was compressed into the arithmetic of years. University in 1945. 1 semester before the calculations became intrusive thoughts. Lumber mill work. Marriage to Sarah in 1946. 4 children by 1953. Teaching them mathematics at the kitchen table. Clean mathematics. Numbers that built things instead of destroying them. He never took them hunting. In 1952, Marines came asking him to teach at Quantico. 3 weeks. Scout sniper school. Not to shoot. Just to teach young men how to calculate death with precision. Marcus almost refused. But Sarah said something that changed the equation. You don't have to hold a rifle, just hold chalk. At Quantico, he stood before 40 Marines who thought shooting was instinct and courage. He filled a blackboard with equations they didn't understand, then rolled up his sleeve showing faded grease pencil marks that would never fully wash away. Every number here represents a Marine who went home. Every miscalculation is one who didn't. You think shooting is courage? It's not. Courage is doing the math, realizing how impossible the shot is and taking it anyway because the alternative is watching your friends die. They learned. Slowly, grudgingly, but they learned. One letter came from Korea in winter. A sniper writing to say he'd made a 900-yard shot using Marcus's arm notation system, that he'd been shaking so hard he could barely hold the rifle, but the mathematics didn't shake. That fear and accuracy could coexist. Marcus read that letter to Sarah and understood what Yamamoto had meant. Teach them better, not better killing. Better understanding that mathematics could save lives by taking them. That the equation mattered less than remembering it represented humans, not just problems. In 1995, Marcus took his grandson Ethan deer hunting. The boy was 20. Marcus was 71 and looked every year of it. They sat in a blind in Michigan woods where his father had taught him to calculate trajectories 6 decades earlier. "Grandpa, you never shoot. You just watch." Marcus smiled. "I calculated 105. That's enough for 10 lifetimes. Now I observe." Ethan made a clean shot at 300 yards. The deer dropped instantly. Marcus watched it fall and felt his father's presence, felt Cross's presence, felt Yamamoto's presence, all the ghosts that mathematics couldn't exercise but had learned to carry. "Good math," he said quietly. "Your great-grandfather would be proud." Marcus Elijah Hayes died June 12, 1998. Heart failure. Peaceful. Sarah held his hand. He was 74 years old. In his final moments, he whispered numbers. Elevation, windage, range. The same calculations he'd written on his arm 54 years earlier. Then he smiled and said something Sarah almost missed. "I see you, Dad, and Cross, and Yamamoto." The math was right. The war was wrong. But the math was right. His family found a footlocker in the basement. Inside was the silver star he'd never worn, a notebook with 105 tally marks, Yamamoto's notebook with 83, letters from Korean war snipers, a photograph of him and Brennan on Peleliu standing beside a rifle with an impossibly long scope, and a note in his handwriting. "The rifle is in the museum. Serial 3928471. It belonged to the mathematics. The mathematics belonged to Dad and Cross and Yamamoto, and everyone who understood that numbers can be perfect and terrible simultaneously. I just carried the one." Today, in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, there's a display in a quiet corner. A Springfield rifle with serial number 3928471. Mounted on top is an unearthly 8-power scope impossibly long with a diagonal crack in the objective lens that catches light like a frozen scar. Most visitors walk past. They want tanks and flamethrowers. They see the rifle and think it looks like something for shooting tin cans. But sometimes a young Marine stops, reads the placard, studies the crack in the glass. An older Marine working as a guard notices. "You know what minute of angle means, son?" "Yes, sir." Hayes could hold 5 MOA in 115-degree heat while people tried to kill him. With that equipment, in 1944. The guard pauses. "Most modern snipers can't do that with gear 10 times better." The young Marine stares with new respect. But here's what the placard doesn't say. The guard's voice softens. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot so Morrison could live, so Walsh could live, so Cross could die knowing someone would tell his sister about Columbia. He shot so Yamamoto could teach him that even enemies speak the same language when it's mathematics. The young Marine nods slowly, understanding something that can't be expressed in ballistic tables. The museum closes. The lights dim. The rifle waits in darkness, the crack in its glass catching moonlight through distant windows. And somewhere in the eternal arithmetic of courage and sacrifice, Marcus Elijah Hayes still carries the one. Still remembers that every number represents a life. Still teaches that mathematics can be perfect, and the wars that require them can be wrong, and both things can be true simultaneously. The glass pipe, the mail-order toy, the hand of God. Silent now. But the equations remain. They always remain.